This is a text-to-speech narration of Leon Trotsky's text, The Lessons of October. Any pronunciation errors are due to the limitations of this technology.
Chapter 4, The April Conference. The speech which Lenin delivered at the Finland railway station on the socialist character of the Russian Revolution was a bombshell to many leaders of the party. The polemic between Lenin and the partisans of completing the democratic revolution began from the very first day. A sharp conflict took place over the armed April demonstration, which raised the slogan, "Down with the provisional government." This incident supplied some representatives of the right wing with a pretext for accusing Lenin of blankism. One, the overthrow of the provisional government, which was supported at that time by the Soviet majority, could be accomplished, if you please, only by disregarding the majority of the toilers. From a formal standpoint, such an accusation might seem rather plausible, but in point of fact there was not the slightest shade of blankism in Lenin's April policy. For Lenin, the whole question hinged on the extent to which the Soviets continued to reflect the real mood of the masses, and whether or not the party was mistaken in guiding itself by the Soviet majority. The April demonstration, which went further to the left than was warranted, was a kind of reconnoitering sortie to test the temper of the masses and the reciprocal relationship between them and the Soviet majority. This reconnoitering operation led to the conclusion that a lengthy preparatory period was necessary. And we observe that Lenin in the beginning of May sharply curbed the men from Kronstadt who had gone too far and had declared against the recognition of the provisional government. The opponents of the struggle for power had an entirely different approach to this question. At the April Party Conference, Comrade Kamenev made the following complaint. In No. 19 of Pravda, a resolution was first proposed by comrades. The reference here is obviously to Lenin LT, to the effect that we should overthrow the provisional government. It appeared in print prior to the last crisis, and this slogan was later rejected as tending to disorganization, and it was recognized as adventuristic. This implies that our comrades learned something during this crisis. The resolution which is now proposed by Lenin LT repeats that mistake. This manner of formulating the question is most highly significant. Lenin, after the experience of the reconnoiter, withdrew the slogan of the immediate overthrow of the provisional government. But he did not withdraw it for any set period of time for so many weeks or months, but strictly in dependence upon how quickly the revolt of the masses against the conciliationists would grow. The opposition, on the contrary, considered the slogan itself to be a blunder. In the temporary retreat of Lenin, there was not even a hint of a change in the political line. It did not proceed from the fact that the democratic revolution was still uncompleted. He based himself exclusively on the idea that the masses were not at the moment capable of overthrowing the provisional government, and that therefore everything possible had to be done to enable the working class to overthrow the provisional government on the morrow. The whole of the April Party Conference was devoted to the following fundamental question. Are we heading toward the conquest of power in the name of the socialist revolution, or are we helping anybody and everybody to complete the democratic revolution? Unfortunately, the report of the April Conference remains unpublished to this very day, though there is scarcely another Congress in the history of our party that had such an exceptional and immediate bearing on the destiny of our revolution as the Conference of April 1917. Lenin's position was this: an irreconcilable struggle against defensism and its supporters, the capture of the Soviet majority, the overthrow of the provisional government, the seizure of power through the Soviets, a revolutionary peace policy, and a program of socialist revolution at home and of international revolution abroad. In distinction to this, as we already know, the opposition held the view that it was necessary to complete the democratic revolution by exerting pressure on the provisional government. And in this process, the Soviets would remain the organs of control over the power of the bourgeoisie. Hence flows quite another, and incomparably more conciliatory attitude to defensism. One of the opponents of Lenin's position argued in the following manner at the April Conference. We speak of the Soviets of workers' and soldiers' deputies as if they were the organizing centers of our own forces and of state power. Their very name shows that they constitute a block of petty bourgeois and proletarian forces which are still confronted with uncompleted bourgeois democratic tasks. Had the bourgeois democratic revolution been completed, this bloc would no longer exist, and the proletariat would be waging a revolutionary struggle against the bloc. And nevertheless, we recognize these Soviets as centers for the organization of forces. Consequently, the bourgeois revolution is not yet completed. It has not yet outlived itself. And I believe that all of us ought to recognize that with the complete accomplishment of this revolution, the power would actually have passed into the hands of the proletariat. From the speech of Comrade Kamenev, the hopeless schematism of this argument is obvious enough. For the crux of the matter lies precisely in the fact that the complete accomplishment of this revolution could never take place without changing the bearers of power. The above speech ignores the class axis of the revolution. It deduces the task of the party not from the actual grouping of class forces, but from a formal definition of the revolution as bourgeois, or as bourgeois democratic. We are to participate in a bloc with the petty bourgeoisie and exercise control over the bourgeois power until the bourgeois revolution has been completely accomplished. The pattern is obviously Menshevik. Imitating in a doctrinaire fashion the tasks of the revolution by its nomenclature a bourgeois revolution, one could not fail to arrive at the policy of exercising control over the provisional government and demanding that the provisional government should bring forward a policy of peace without annexations, and so on. By the completion of the democratic revolution was understood a series of reforms to be effected through the Constituent Assembly. Moreover, the Bolshevik Party was assigned the role of a left wing in the Constituent Assembly. Such an outlook deprived the slogan, "All power to the Soviets," of any actual meaning. This was best and most consistently and most thoroughly expressed at the April conference by the late Nagin, who also belonged to the opposition. In the process of development, the most important functions of the Soviets will fall away. A whole series of administrative functions will be transferred to the municipal, district, and other institutions. If we examine the future development of the structure of the state, we cannot deny that the Constituent Assembly will be convoked, and after that the Parliament. Thus, it follows that the most important functions of the Soviets will gradually wither away. That, however, does not mean to say that the Soviets will end their existence in ignominy. They will only transfer their functions. Under these same Soviets, we shall not achieve the Commune Republic in our country. Finally, a third opponent dealt with the question from the standpoint that Russia was not ready for socialism. Can we count on the support of the masses if we raise the slogan of proletarian revolution? Russia is the most petty bourgeois country in Europe. To count on the sympathy of the masses for a socialist revolution is impossible. And consequently, the more the party holds to the standpoint of a socialist revolution, the further it will be reduced to the role of a propaganda circle. The impetus to a socialist revolution must come from the West. And further on, where will the sun of the socialist revolution rise? I believe that, in view of all the circumstances and our general cultural level, it is not for us to initiate the socialist revolution. We lack the necessary forces. The objective conditions for it do not exist in our country. But for the West, this question is posed much in the same manner as the question of overthrowing Tsarism in our country. Not all the opponents of Lenin's point of view at the April conference drew the same conclusions as Nagin, but all of them were logically forced to accept these conclusions several months later, on the eve of October. Either we must assume leadership of the proletarian revolution, or we must accept the role of an opposition in a bourgeois parliament. That is how the question was posed within our party. It is perfectly obvious that the latter position was essentially a Menshevik position, or rather the position which the Mensheviks found themselves compelled to occupy after the February Revolution. As a matter of fact, the Mensheviks had for many years tapped away like so many woodpeckers at the idea that the coming revolution must be bourgeois, that the government of a bourgeois revolution could only perform bourgeois tasks, that the social democracy could not take upon itself the tasks of bourgeois democracy and must remain in opposition while pushing the bourgeoisie to the left. This theme was developed with a particularly boring profundity by Martinov. With the inception of the bourgeois revolution in 1917, the Mensheviks soon found themselves on the staff of the government. Out of their entire principled position, There remained only one political conclusion, namely, that the proletariat dare not seize power. But it is plain enough that those Bolsheviks who indicted Menshevik ministerialism, and who at the same time were opposed to the seizure of power by the proletariat were, in point of fact, shifting to the pre-revolutionary positions of the Mensheviks. The revolution caused political shifts to take place in two directions. The reactionaries became cadets too, and the cadets became Republicans against their own wishes, a purely formal shift to the left. The social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks became the ruling bourgeois party, a shift to the right. These are the means whereby bourgeois society seeks to create for itself a new backbone for state power, stability, and order. But at the same time, while the Mensheviks were passing from a formal socialist position to a vulgar democratic one, the right wing of the Bolsheviks was shifting to a formal socialist position, i.e., the Menshevik position of yesterday. The same regroupment of forces took place on the question of war. The bourgeoisie, except for a few doctrinaires, kept wearily droning the same tune. No annexations, no indemnities, all the more so because the hopes for annexation were already very slim. The Zimmerwaldian Mensheviks III and the SRS, who had criticized the French socialists because they defended their bourgeois republican fatherland, themselves immediately became defensists the moment they felt themselves part of a bourgeois republic. From a passive internationalist position, they shifted to an active patriotic one. At the same time, the right wing of the Bolsheviks went over to a passive internationalist position, exerting pressure on the provisional government for the sake of a democratic peace, without annexations and without indemnities. Thus, at the April conference, the formula of the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry was driven asunder both theoretically and politically, and from it emerged two antagonistic points of view: a democratic point of view, camouflaged by formal socialist reservations, and a revolutionary socialist point of view, the genuinely Bolshevik and Leninist point of view. Chapter 5: The July Days, the Kornilov episode, the Democratic Conference, and the pre-parliament. The decisions of the April conference gave the party a correct principled orientation, but they did not liquidate the disagreements among the party leaders. On the contrary, with the march of events, these disagreements assume more concrete forms and reach their sharpest expression during the most decisive moment of the revolution in the October days. The attempt to organize a demonstration on June 10 on Lenin's initiative was denounced as an adventure by the very same comrades who had been dissatisfied with the character of the April demonstration. The demonstration of June 10 did not take place because it was prescribed by the Congress of Soviets. But on June 18 the party avenged itself. The general demonstration at Petrograd, which the conciliators had rather imprudently initiated, took place almost wholly under Bolshevik slogans. Nevertheless, the government sought to have its own way. It light-mindedly ordered the idiotic offensive at the front. The moment was decisive. Lenin kept warning the party against imprudent steps. On June 21, he wrote in Pravda, "Comrades, a demonstrative act at this juncture would be inexpedient. We are now compelled to live through an entirely new stage in our revolution." But the July days impended an important landmark on the road of revolution, as well as on the road of the internal party disagreements. In the July movement, the decisive moment came with a spontaneous onslaught by the Petrograd masses. It is indubitable that in July Lenin was weighing in his mind questions like these: has the time come? Has the mood of the masses outgrown the Soviet superstructure? Are we running the risk of becoming hypnotized by Soviet legality, and of lagging behind the mood of the masses, and of being severed from them? It is very probable that isolated and purely military operations during the July days were initiated by comrades who honestly believed that they were not diverging from Lenin's estimate of the situation. Lenin afterwards said, "We did a great many foolish things in July." But the gist of the July days was that we made a new and much more extensive reconnoiter on a new and higher stage of the movement. We had to make a retreat under onerous conditions. The party, to the extent that it was preparing for the insurrection and the seizure of power, considered, as did Lenin, that the July demonstration was only an episode in which we had to pay dearly for an exploration of our own strength and the enemy's, but which could not alter the main line of our activity. On the other hand, the comrades who were opposed to the policy aimed at the seizure of power were bound to see a pernicious adventure in the July episode. The mobilization of the right-wing elements in the party became increasingly intensive. Their criticism became more outspoken. There was also a corresponding change in the tone of rebuttal. Lenin wrote, "All this whining, all these arguments to the effect that we should not have participated in the attempt to lend a peaceable and organized character to the perfectly legitimate popular discontent and indignation, are either sheer apostasy, if coming from Bolsheviks, or the usual expression of the usual cowed and confused state of the petty bourgeoisie." CW Vol 25, Constitutional Illusions, July 26, 1917, p. 204. The use of the word apostasy at such a time sheds a tragic light upon the disagreements. As the events unfolded, this ominous word appeared more and more often. The opportunist attitude toward the question of power and the question of war determined, of course, a corresponding attitude toward the international. The Rights made an attempt to draw the party into the Stockholm Conference, one of the social patriots. Lenin wrote on August 16. The speech made by Comrade Kamenev on August 6 in the Central Executive Committee on the Stockholm Conference cannot but meet with reproof from all Bolsheviks who are faithful to their party and principles. And further on, in reference to certain statements alleging that a great revolutionary banner was being unfurled over Stockholm, Lenin said, "This is a meaningless declamation in the spirit of Chernov and Tseretelli. Too, it is a blatant untruth. In actual fact, it is not the revolutionary banner that is beginning to wave over Stockholm, but the banner of deals, agreements, amnesty for the social imperialists, and negotiations among bankers for dividing up annexed territory. CW Vol 25. Kamenev's speech in the Central Executive Committee on the Stockholm Conference, August 16, 1917, pp. 240-41. The road to Stockholm was, in effect, the road to the Second International, just as taking part in the pre-parliament was the road to the bourgeois republic. Lenin was for the boycott of the Stockholm Conference, just as later he was for the boycott of the pre-parliament. In the very heat of the struggle, he did not for a single moment forget the tasks of creating a new communist international. As early as April 10, Lenin came forward with a proposal to change the name of the party. All objections against the new name he characterized as follows. It is an argument of routinism, an argument of inertia, an argument of stagnation. It is time to cast off the soiled shirt and to put on clean linen. CW Vol 24, Tasks of the Proletariat in Our Revolution, a draft program for the Proletarian Party, April 10, 1917, p. 88. Nevertheless, the opposition of the party leaders was so strong that a whole year had to pass by, in the course of which all of Russia cast off the filthy garments of bourgeois domination before the party could make up its mind to take a new name, returning to the tradition of Marx and Engels. This incident of renaming the party serves as a symbolic expression of Lenin's role throughout the whole of 1917. During the sharpest turning point in history, he was all the while waging an intense struggle within the party against the day that had passed in the name of the day to come, and the opposition, belonging to the day that had passed, marching under the banner of tradition, became at times aggravated to the extreme. The Kornilov events 3, which created an abrupt shift in the situation in our favor, acted to soften the differences temporarily. They were softened but not eliminated. In the right wing, a tendency manifested itself during those days to draw closer to the Soviet majority on the basis of defending the revolution, and in part, the fatherland. Lenin's reaction to this was expressed in his letter to the Central Committee at the beginning of September. It is my conviction that those who become unprincipled are people who 4. Slide into defensism, or like other Bolsheviks into a bloc with the SRS, into supporting the provisional government. Their attitude is absolutely wrong and unprincipled. We shall become defensists only after the transfer of power to the proletariat. Even now we must not support Kerensky's government. This is unprincipled. We may be asked, aren't we going to fight against Kornilov? Of course we must, but this is not the same thing. There is a dividing line here, which is being stepped over by some Bolsheviks who fall into compromise and allow themselves to be carried away by the course of events. CW Vol 25, to the Central Committee of the RSDLP, August 30, 1917, pp. 285-86. The next stage in the evolution of divergent views was the Democratic Conference, September 1422, and the pre-parliament that followed it, October 7. 5. The task of the Mensheviks and the SRS consisted in entangling the Bolsheviks in Soviet legality and afterwards painlessly transforming the latter into bourgeois parliamentary legality. The Rights were ready to welcome this. We are already acquainted with their manner of portraying the future development of the revolution. The Soviets would gradually surrender their functions to corresponding institutions, to the Dumas, the Zemstvos, the trade unions, and finally to the Constituent Assembly, and would automatically vanish from the scene. Through the channel of the pre-parliament, the political awareness of the masses was to be directed away from the Soviets as temporary and dying institutions, to the Constituent Assembly as the crowning work of the democratic revolution. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks were already in the majority in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. Our influence in the army grew, not from day to day, but from hour to hour. It was no longer a question of prognosis or perspective. It was literally a question of how we were to act the next day. The conduct of the completely drained conciliationist parties at the Democratic Conference was the incarnation of petty vileness. Yet the proposal which we introduced to abandon the Democratic Conference demonstratively, leaving it to its doom, met with decisive opposition on the part of the right elements of the fraction who were still influential at the top. The clash on this question was a prelude to the struggle over the question of boycotting the pre-parliament. On September 24, i.e., after the Democratic Conference, Lenin wrote, "The Bolsheviks should have walked out of the meeting in protest and not allowed themselves to be caught by the conference trap set to divert the people's attention from serious questions." CW Vol 26, Heroes of Fraud and the Mistakes of the Bolsheviks, September 22, 1917, p. 48. The discussion in the Bolshevik fraction at the Democratic Conference over the question of boycotting the pre-parliament had an exceptional importance despite the comparatively narrow scope of the issue itself. As a matter of fact, it was the most extensive and, on the surface, most successful attempt on the part of the Rights to turn the party onto the path of completing the democratic revolution. Apparently, no minutes of these discussions were taken. In any case, no record has remained. To my knowledge, even the secretary's notes have not been located as yet. The editors of this volume found a few scanty documents among my own papers. Comrade Kornilov expounded a line of argument which, later on, was developed in a sharper and more defined form and embodied in the well-known letter of Kornilov and Zinoviev dated October 11 to the party organizations. The most principled formulation of the question was made by Nogin. The boycott of the pre-parliament is a summons to an insurrection, i.e., to a repetition of the July days. Other comrades based themselves on general considerations of social democratic parliamentary tactics. No one would dare, so they said in substance, propose that we boycott the parliament. Nevertheless, a proposal is made that we boycott an identical institution merely because it is called a pre-parliament. The basic conception of the Rights was as follows. The revolution must inevitably lead from the Soviets to the establishment of bourgeois parliamentarism. The pre-parliament forms a natural link in this process. Therefore, it is folly to refuse to take part in the pre-parliament in view of our readiness to occupy the left benches in the parliament itself. It was necessary to complete the democratic revolution and prepare for the socialist revolution. How were we to prepare? By passing through the school of bourgeois parliamentarism. Because, you see, the advanced country shows the backward country the image of its own future. The downfall of the Tsarist monarchy is viewed as revolutionary, and so it was, but the conquest of power by the proletariat is conceived in a parliamentary way, on the basis of a completely accomplished democracy. Many long years of a democratic regime must elapse in the interval between the bourgeois revolution and the proletarian revolution. The struggle for our participation in the pre-parliament was the struggle for the Europeanization of the working class movement, for directing it as quickly as possible into the channel of a democratic struggle for power, i.e., into the channel of social democracy. Our fraction in the Democratic Conference, numbering over 100 individuals, did not differ greatly, especially during those days, from a party congress. The majority of the fraction expressed itself in favor of participating in the pre-parliament. This fact was itself sufficient cause for alarm. And from that moment Lenin did sound the alarm unceasingly. While the Democratic Conference was in session, Lenin wrote, "It would be a big mistake, sheer parliamentary cretinism on our part, if we were to regard the Democratic Conference as a parliament. For even if it were to proclaim itself a permanent and sovereign parliament of the revolution, it would nevertheless decide nothing. The power of decision lies outside it in the working-class quarters of Petrograd and Moscow." CW Vol 26 Marxism and Insurrection, a letter to the Central Committee of the RSDLP September 13 and 14, 1917, p. 25. Lenin's appraisal of the importance of participation or non-participation in the pre-parliament can be gathered from many of his declarations, and particularly from his letter of September 29 to the Central Committee, in which he speaks of such glaring errors on the part of the Bolsheviks as the shameful decision to participate in the pre-parliament. CW Vol 26. The crisis has matured September 29, 1917, p. 84 for him. This decision was an expression of the same democratic illusions and petty bourgeois vacillations against which he had fought, developing and perfecting in the course of that struggle his conception of the proletarian revolution. It is not true that many years must elapse between the bourgeois and proletarian revolutions. It is not true that the school of parliamentarism is the one and only, or the main, or the compulsory training school for the conquest of power. It is not true that the road to power runs necessarily through bourgeois democracy. These are all naked abstractions, doctrinaire patterns, and they play only one political role, namely, to bind the proletarian vanguard hand and foot, and by means of the democratic state machinery turn it into an oppositionist political shadow of the bourgeoisie, bearing the name of social democracy. The policy of the proletariat must not be guided by schoolboy patterns, but in accordance with the real flux of the class struggle. Our task is not to go to the pre-parliament, but to organize the insurrection and seize power. The rest will follow. Lenin even proposed to call an emergency party congress, advancing as a platform the boycott of the pre-parliament. Henceforth all his letters and articles hammer at a single point. We must go, not into the pre-parliament to act as a revolutionary tale of the conciliators, but out into the streets to struggle for power. Chapter 6, On the Eve of the October Revolution, the Aftermath. An emergency congress proved unnecessary. The pressure exerted by Lenin secured the requisite shift of forces to the left, both within the Central Committee and in our fraction in the pre-parliament. The Bolsheviks withdrew from it on October 10. In Petrograd, the Soviet clashed with the government over the order transferring to the front the part of the garrison which sympathized with the Bolsheviks. On October 16, the Revolutionary Military Committee was created, the legal Soviet organ of insurrection. The right wing of the party sought to retard the development of events. The struggle of tendencies within the party, as well as the class struggle in the country, entered its decisive phase. The position of the rights is best and most completely illumined in its principled aspects by a letter signed by Zinoviev and Kamenev and entitled On the Current Situation. The letter was written on October 11, that is, 2 weeks before the insurrection, and it was sent to the most important party organizations. The letter comes out in decisive opposition to the resolution for an armed insurrection adopted by the Central Committee, cautioning against underestimating the enemy, while in reality monstrously underestimating the forces of revolution, and even denying that the masses are in a mood for battle 2 weeks before October 25, the letter states. We are deeply convinced that to call at present for an armed uprising means to stake on one card, not only the fate of our party, but also the fate of the Russian and international revolution. But if the insurrection and the seizure of power are out of the question, what then? The answer in the letter is also quite plain and precise. Through the army, through the workers, we hold a revolver at the temple of the bourgeoisie. And because of this revolver, the bourgeoisie will be unable to quash the Constituent Assembly. The chances of our party in the elections to the Constituent Assembly are excellent. The influence of the Bolsheviks is increasing. With correct tactics, we can get a third and even more of the seats in the Constituent Assembly. Thus, this letter openly steers a course towards our playing the role of an influential opposition in a bourgeois Constituent Assembly. This purely social democratic course is superficially camouflaged by the following consideration. The Soviets, which have become rooted in life, cannot be destroyed. The Constituent Assembly will be able to find support for its revolutionary work only in the Soviets. The Constituent Assembly plus the Soviets, that is that combined type of state institution towards which we are going. It is of extraordinary interest with regard to characterizing the entire line of the rights that the theory of combined state forms. The correlation of the Constituent Assembly with the Soviets was reiterated in Germany a year and a half or 2 years later by Rudolf Hilferding, who also waged a struggle against the seizure of power by the proletariat. The Austro-German opportunist was unaware that he was plagiarizing. The letter on the current situation refutes the assertion that the majority of the people in Russia were already supporting us, on the basis of a purely parliamentary estimate of this majority. In Russia, a majority of the workers, the letter states, and a substantial part of the soldiers are with us. But all the rest is dubious. We are all convinced, for instance, that if elections to the Constituent Assembly were to take place now, a majority of the peasants would vote for the SRS. What is this? An accident? The above formulation of the question contains the principal and fundamental error, flowing from a failure to understand that the peasants might have strong revolutionary interests and an intense urge to realize them, but cannot have an independent political position. They might either vote for the bourgeoisie by voting for its SR agency or join in action with the proletariat. Which one of these two possibilities would materialize hinged precisely upon the policy we pursued. Had we gone to the pre-parliament in order to constitute an influential opposition, a third and even more of the seats in the Constituent Assembly, then we would have almost automatically placed the peasantry in such a position as would have compelled it to seek the satisfaction of its interests through the Constituent Assembly, and consequently they would have looked not to the opposition but to the majority. On the other hand, the seizure of power by the proletariat immediately created the revolutionary framework for the struggle of the peasantry against the landlords and the officials. To use the expressions so current among us on this question, this letter expresses simultaneously both an underestimation and an overestimation of the peasantry. It underestimates the revolutionary potential of the peasants under a proletarian leadership, and it overestimates their political independence. This twofold error of overestimating and at the same time underestimating the peasantry flows, in its turn, from an underestimation of our own class and its party, that is, from a social democratic approach to the proletariat. And this is not at all surprising. All shades of opportunism are, in the last analysis, reducible to an incorrect evaluation of the revolutionary forces and potential of the proletariat. Objecting to the seizure of power, the letter tries to scare the party with the prospect of a revolutionary war. The masses of the soldiers support us not because of the slogan of war, but because of the slogan of peace. If having taken power at present by ourselves, we should come to the conclusion in view of the whole world situation that it is necessary to wage a revolutionary war, the masses of soldiers will rush away from us. The best part of the army youth will, of course, remain with us, but the masses of the soldiers will turn away. This line of reasoning is most highly instructive. We have here the basic arguments in favor of signing the Brest-Litovsk Peace I. In the present instance, however, they are being directed against the seizure of power. It is plain enough that the position expressed in the letter on the current situation later facilitated in the highest degree the acceptance of the Brest-Litovsk peace by those who supported the views expressed in the above letter. It remains for us to repeat here what we said in another place, namely, that the political genius of Lenin is characterized not by taking the temporary Brest-Litovsk capitulation as an isolated fact, but only by considering Brest-Litovsk in combination with October. This must always be kept in mind. The working class struggles and matures in the never-failing consciousness of the fact that the preponderance of forces lies on the side of the enemy. This preponderance manifests itself in daily life, at every step. The enemy possesses wealth and state power, all the means of exerting ideological pressure, and all the instruments of repression. We become habituated to the idea that the preponderance of forces is on the enemy's side, and this habitual thought enters as an integral part into the entire life and activity of the Revolutionary Party during the preparatory epoch. The consequences entailed by this or that careless or premature act serve each time as most cruel reminders of the enemy's strength. But a moment comes when this habit of regarding the enemy as stronger becomes the main obstacle on the road to victory. Today's weakness of the bourgeoisie seems to be cloaked by the shadow of its strength of yesterday. You underestimate the strength of the enemy. This cry serves as the axis for the grouping of all elements opposed to the armed insurrection. But everyone who does not want merely to talk about uprising, wrote the opponents of insurrection in our own country, 2 weeks before our victory, must carefully weigh its chances. And here we consider it our duty to say that at the present moment, it would be most harmful to underestimate the forces of our opponent and overestimate our own forces. The forces of the opponent are greater than they appear. Petrograd is decisive, and in Petrograd the enemies of the Proletarian Party have accumulated substantial forces. 5,000 military cadets, excellently armed, organized, anxious because of their class position, and able to fight. Also the staff, shock troops, Cossacks, a substantial part of the garrison, and very considerable artillery, which has taken up a position in fan-like formation around Petrograd. Then our adversaries will undoubtedly attempt, with the aid of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee of the Soviets, to bring troops from the front. On the current situation, in a civil war, to the extent that it is not a question of merely counting battalions beforehand, but of drawing a rough balance of their state of consciousness, such an estimate can, of course, never prove completely satisfactory or adequate. Even Lenin estimated that the enemy had strong forces in Petrograd, and he proposed that the insurrection begin in Moscow where, as he thought, it might be carried out almost without bloodshed. Such partial mistakes of forecast are absolutely unavoidable, even under the most favorable circumstances, and it is always more correct to make plans in accordance with the less favorable conditions. But of interest to us in the given case is the fact that the enemy forces were monstrously overestimated, and that all proportions were completely distorted at a time when the enemy was actually deprived of any armed force. This question, as the experience of Germany proved, is of paramount importance. So long as the slogan of insurrection was approached by the leaders of the German Communist Party mainly, if not solely, from an agitational standpoint, they simply ignored the question of the armed forces at the disposal of the enemy Reichswehr, fascist detachments, police, etc. It seemed to them that the constantly rising revolutionary flood tide would automatically solve the military question. But when the task stared them in the face, the very same comrades who had previously treated the armed forces of the enemy as if they were non-existent went immediately to the other extreme. They placed implicit faith in all the statistics of the armed strength of the bourgeoisie, meticulously added to the latter the forces of the Reichswehr and the police. Then they reduced the whole to a round number 500,000 and more, and so obtained a compact mass force armed to the teeth and absolutely sufficient to paralyze their own efforts. No doubt the forces of the German counter-revolution were much stronger numerically, and at any rate better organized and prepared than our own Kornilovites and semi-Kornilovites. But so were the effective forces of the German Revolution. The proletariat composes the overwhelming majority of the population in Germany. In our country, the question, at least during the initial stage, was decided by Petrograd and Moscow. In Germany, the insurrection would have immediately blazed in scores of mighty proletarian centers. On this arena, the armed forces of the enemy would not have seemed nearly as terrible as they did in statistical computations, expressed in round figures. In any case, we must categorically reject the tendentious calculations which were made, and which are still being made, after the debacle of the German October, in order to justify the policy that led to the debacle. Our Russian example is of great significance in this connection. 2 weeks prior to our bloodless victory in Petrograd, and we could have gained it even 2 weeks earlier, experienced party politicians saw arrayed against us the military cadets, anxious and able to fight, the shock troops, the Cossacks, a substantial part of the garrison, the artillery in fan-like formation, and the troops arriving from the front. But in reality, all this came to nothing. In round figures, 0. Now, let us imagine for a moment that the opponents of the insurrection had carried the day in our party and in the Central Committee. The part that leadership plays in a civil war is all too clear. In such a case, the revolution would have been doomed beforehand unless Lenin had appealed to the party against the Central Committee, which he was preparing to do, and in which he would undoubtedly have been successful. But under similar conditions, not every party will have its Lenin. It is not difficult to imagine how history would have been written had the line of evading the battle carried in the Central Committee. The official historians would, of course, have explained that an insurrection in October 1917 would have been sheer madness, and they would have furnished the reader with awe-inspiring statistical charts of the military cadets and Cossacks and shock troops and artillery in fan-like formation and army corps arriving from the front. Never tested in the fire of insurrection, these forces would have seemed immeasurably more terrible than they proved in action. Here is the lesson which must be burned into the consciousness of every revolutionist. The persistent, tireless, and incessant pressure which Lenin exerted on the Central Committee throughout September and October arose from his constant fear, lest we allow the propitious moment to slip away. "All this is nonsense," replied the Rights. "Our influence will continue to grow." Who was right? And what does it mean to lose the propitious moment? This question directly involves an issue on which the Bolshevik estimate of the ways and means of revolution comes into sharpest and clearest conflict with the Social Democratic Menshevik estimate, the former being active, strategic, and practical through and through, while the latter is utterly permeated with fatalism. What does it mean to lose the propitious moment? The most favorable conditions for an insurrection exist, obviously, when the maximum shift in our favor has occurred in the relationship of forces. We are, of course, referring to the relationship of forces in the domain of consciousness, i.e., in the domain of the political superstructure, and not in the domain of the economic foundation, which may be assumed to remain more or less unchanged throughout the entire revolutionary epoch. On one and the same economic foundation, with one and the same class division of society, the relationship of forces changes depending upon the mood of the proletarian masses, the extent to which their illusions are shattered, and their political experience has grown, the extent to which the confidence of intermediate classes and groups in the state power is shattered, and finally the extent to which the latter loses confidence in itself. During revolution, all these processes take place with lightning speed. The whole tactical art consists in this, that we seize the moment when the combination of circumstances is most favorable to us. The Kornilov uprising completely prepared such a combination. The masses, having lost confidence in the parties of the Soviet majority, saw with their own eyes the danger of counter-revolution. They came to the conclusion that it was now up to the Bolsheviks to find a way out of the situation. Neither the elemental disintegration of the state power, nor the elemental influx of the impatient and exacting confidence of the masses in the Bolsheviks could endure for a protracted period of time. The crisis had to be resolved one way or another. "It is now or never," Lenin kept repeating. The Right said in refutation, "It would be a serious historical untruth to formulate the question of the transfer of power into the hands of the proletarian party in the terms, either now or never. No, the party of the proletariat will grow. Its program will become known to broader and broader masses, and there is only one way in which the proletarian party can interrupt its successes, and that is if under present conditions it takes upon itself to initiate an uprising. Against this perilous policy we raise our voice in warning." On the current situation, this fatalistic optimism deserves most careful study. There is nothing national and certainly nothing individual about it. Only last year we witnessed the very same tendency in Germany. This passive fatalism is really only a cover for irresolution and even incapacity for action, but it camouflages itself with the consoling prognosis that we are, growing more and more influential. As time goes on, our forces will continually increase. What a gross delusion! The strength of our revolutionary party increases only up to a certain moment, after which the process can turn into the very opposite. The hopes of the masses change into disillusionment as the result of the party's passivity, while the enemy recovers from his panic and takes advantage of this disillusionment. We witnessed such a decisive turning point in Germany in October 1923. We were not so very far removed from a similar turn of events in Russia in the fall of 1917. For that, a delay of a few more weeks would perhaps have been enough. Lenin was right. It was now or never. But the decisive question, and here the opponents of the insurrection brought forward their last and strongest argument, is the sentiment among the workers and soldiers of the capital really such that they see salvation only in street fighting, that they are impatient to go into the streets? No, there is no such sentiment. If among the great masses of the poor of the capital there were a militant sentiment burning to go into the streets, it might have served as a guarantee that an uprising initiated by them would draw in the biggest organizations, railroad unions, unions of postal and telegraph workers, etc., where the influence of our party is weak. But since there is no such sentiment even in the factories and barracks, it would be a self-deception to build any plans on it. On the current situation. These lines written on October 11 acquire an exceptional and most timely significance when we recall that the leading comrades in the German party, in their attempt to explain away their retreat last year without striking a blow, especially emphasized the reluctance of the masses to fight. But the very crux of the matter lies in the fact that a victorious insurrection becomes, generally speaking, most assured when the masses have had sufficient experience not to plunge headlong into the struggle, but to wait and demand a resolute and capable fighting leadership. In October 1917, the working-class masses, or at least their leading section, had already come to the firm conviction on the basis of the experience of the April demonstration, the July days, and the Kornilov events that neither isolated elemental protests nor reconnoitering operations were any longer on the agenda, but a decisive insurrection for the seizure of power. The mood of the masses correspondingly became more concentrated, more critical, and more profound. A transition from an illusory, exuberant, elemental mood to a more critical and conscious frame of mind necessarily implies a pause in revolutionary continuity. Such a progressive crisis in the mood of the masses can be overcome only by a proper party policy. That is to say, above all by the genuine readiness and ability of the party to lead the insurrection of the proletariat. On the other hand, a party which carries on a protracted revolutionary agitation, tearing the masses away from the influence of the conciliationists, and then, after the confidence of the masses has been raised to the utmost, begins to vacillate, to split hairs, to hedge, and to temporize, such a party paralyzes the activity of the masses, sows disillusion and disintegration among them, and brings ruin to the revolution. But in return it provides itself with the ready excuse after the debacle that the masses were insufficiently active. This was precisely the course steered by the letter on the current situation. Luckily, our party under the leadership of Lenin was decisively able to liquidate such moods among the leaders. Because of this alone, it was able to guide a victorious revolution. We have characterized the nature of the political questions bound up with the preparation for the October Revolution, and we have attempted to clarify the gist of the differences that arose, and now it remains for us to trace briefly the most important moments of the internal party struggle during the last decisive weeks. The resolution for an armed insurrection was adopted by the Central Committee on October 10. On October 11, the letter on the current situation analyzed above was sent out to the most important party organizations. On October 18, that is, a week before the revolution, Novaya Zhizn New Life published the letter of Kornilov. Not only Comrade Zinoviev and I, we read in this letter, but also a number of practical comrades think that to assume the initiative of an armed insurrection at the present moment, with the given correlation of forces, independently of and several days before the Congress of Soviets, is an inadmissible step ruinous to the proletariat and to the revolution. Novaya Zhizn, No. 156, October 18, 1917. On October 25, power was seized in Petrograd and the Soviet government was created. On November 4, a number of responsible party members resigned from the Central Committee of the party and from the Council of People's Commissars, and issued an ultimatum demanding the formation of a coalition government composed of all Soviet parties. Otherwise, they wrote, the only course that remains is to maintain a purely Bolshevik government by means of political terror. 2. And in another document, issued at the same time, we cannot assume any responsibility for this ruinous policy of the Central Committee, which has been adopted contrary to the will of the great majority of the proletariat and the soldiers who are longing for the quickest possible cessation of bloodshed between the different sections of democracy. For this reason, we resign from our posts in the Central Committee in order to avail ourselves of the right to express our candid opinions to the masses of workers and soldiers and summon them to support our cry. Long live the government of all Soviet parties. Immediate conciliation on this basis. The October Revolution, Archives of the Revolution 1917, pp. 407-10. Thus, those who had opposed the armed insurrection and the seizure of power as an adventure were demanding, after the victorious conclusion of the insurrection, that the power be restored to those parties against whom the proletariat had to struggle in order to conquer power. And why, indeed, was the victorious Bolshevik Party obliged to restore power to the Mensheviks and the SRS? And it was precisely the restoration of power that was in question here. To this the opposition replied, we consider that the creation of such a government is necessary for the sake of preventing further bloodshed, an imminent famine, the crushing of the revolution by Kaledin and his cohorts, and in order to ensure the convocation of the Constituent Assembly and the actual carrying through of the program of peace adopted by the All-Russian Congress of Soviets of Soldiers and Workers' Deputies. Ibid. pp. 407-10. In other words, it was a question of clearing a path for bourgeois parliamentarianism through the portals of the Soviets. The revolution had refused to pass through the pre-parliament and had to cut a channel for itself through October. Therefore, the task, as formulated by the opposition, consisted in saving the revolution from the dictatorship with the help of the Mensheviks and the SRS by diverting it into the channel of a bourgeois regime. What was in question here was the liquidation of October, no more, no less. Naturally, there could be no talk whatever of conciliation under such conditions. On the next day, November 5, still another letter, along the same lines, was published. I cannot, in the name of party discipline, remain silent when in the face of common sense and the elemental movement of the masses, Marxists refuse to take into consideration objective conditions which imperiously dictate to us, under the threat of a catastrophe, conciliation with all the socialist parties. I cannot, in the name of party discipline, submit to the cult of personal worship and stake political conciliation with all socialist parties who agree to our basic demands upon the inclusion of this or that individual in the ministry, nor am I willing for that reason to prolong the bloodshed even for a single minute. Rабочая Gazeta Workers' Journal, No. 204, Nov. 5, 1917. The author of this letter, Lazovsky, ends by declaring it urgent to fight for an emergency party congress which would decide the question whether the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party Bolsheviks will remain a Marxist working-class party, or whether it will finally adopt a course which has nothing in common with revolutionary Marxism. Ibid. The situation seemed perfectly hopeless. Not only the bourgeoisie and the landlords, not only the so-called revolutionary democracy, who still retained the control of the leading bodies of many organizations, the All-Russian Central Executive Committee of Railwomen Viktual, the Army Committees, the government employees, and so on, but also some of the most influential members of our own party, members of the Central Committee and the Council of People's Commissars, were loud in their public condemnation of the party's attempt to remain in power in order to carry out its program. The situation might have seemed hopeless, we repeat, if one looked only at the surface of events. What then remained? To acquiesce to the demands of the opposition meant to liquidate October. In that case, we should not have achieved it in the first place. Only one course was left: to march ahead, relying upon the revolutionary will of the masses. On November 7, Pravda carried the decisive declaration of the Central Committee of our party, written by Lenin and permeated with real revolutionary fervor, expressed in clear, simple, and unmistakable formulations addressed to the rank and file of the party. This proclamation put an end to any doubt as to the future policy of the party and its central committee. Shame on all the faint-hearted, all the waverers and doubters, on all those who allowed themselves to be intimidated by the bourgeoisie or who have succumbed to the outcries of their direct and indirect supporters. There is not the slightest hesitation among the mass of the workers and soldiers of Petrograd, Moscow, and other places. Our party stands solidly and firmly as one man in defense of Soviet power, in defense of the interests of all the working people, and first and foremost of the workers and poor peasants. CW Vol 26. From the Central Committee of the RSDLPB to all party members, and to all the working classes of Russia, November 5-6, 1917, pp. 305-06. The extremely acute party crisis was overcome. However, the internal party struggle did not yet cease. The main lines of the struggle still remained the same. But its political importance faded. We find most interesting evidence of this in a report made by Uritsky at a session of the Petrograd Committee of our party on December 12, on the subject of convening the Constituent Assembly. The disagreements within our party are not new. We have here the same tendency which manifested itself previously on the question of the insurrection. Some comrades are now of the opinion that the Constituent Assembly is the crowning work of the revolution. They base their position on the hook of etiquette. They say we must not act tactlessly, and so on. They object to the Bolsheviks, as members of the Constituent Assembly, deciding the date to convoke it, the relationship of forces in it, and so on. They look at things from a purely formal standpoint, leaving entirely out of consideration the fact that the exercise of this control is only a reflection of the events taking place outside the Constituent Assembly, and that with this consideration in mind we are able to outline our attitude toward the Constituent Assembly. At the present time our point of view is that we are fighting for the interests of the proletariat and the poor peasantry, while a handful of comrades consider that we are making a bourgeois revolution which must be crowned by the Constituent Assembly. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly may be considered as marking the close not only of a great chapter in the history of Russia, but of an equally important chapter in the history of our party. By overcoming the internal friction, the party of the proletariat not only conquered power, but was able to maintain it.